everyone out there. Welcome to insideTauck and our live webinar. My name is Kelly and I'll be your moderator today. I'm coming to you virtually from the beautiful town of Pinhão on the Douro River in Portugal. Though we can't be there right now, we can imagine sailing together on a brand new Tauck riverboat, sitting poolside with a drink in hand and overlooking the vineyards. Now that I've set that scene, before we get started, I'd like to let you know that we will be allowing for a brief Q&A session after the presentation. So please submit your questions as they come to your mind using the chat feature that's at the bottom of your screen. Now, to our speaker, Halsey Kinne. Halsey has been directing tours since 2015. She's captured the hearts of Tauck guests of all ages, leading our Bridges family tours, and soon she'll be with us on the Douro River. And wow, does she have a passion for Portugal? Her love of the country and its culture began in university while studying international affairs at FSU. She dove deeper as a student living in Brazil, studying classical Portuguese literature and traditional linguistics. This afternoon, she's telling us the story of how a little country like Portugal has made a big impact on the signature dishes we see around the globe today. Please enjoy Halsey.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Halsey Kinne, and let's just jump straight into our presentation. So I know, like many of you, I am very excited to get back out on the road and begin traveling again, because the best part of travel is getting to experience brand new cultures. Whether it's the language, the customs, or the traditions, there's always something new to be learned. But I think that probably my most favorite part of any new culture has to be the food. There's something absolutely magical about arriving to a new destination and trying a dish that is part of the cultural identity of a country, and where most people could just accept this at face value. I was that kid growing up that always had to ask how and why, much to the annoyance of my parents. But I carried this with me as an adult, and so upon traveling to these new destinations and trying these foods, I thought, how did that come to be? And with a little bit of research, I was surprised to find out that staple dishes like Japanese tempura, British tea, Mozambican piri chicken, Brazilian feijoada, and Indian vindaloo, those staples and respected in their countries, were actually a result of 15th century Portuguese navigation. In fact, the number of food products that are appearing on your screen all came about because there was a fervorous desire to achieve glory, God, and gold during the Age of Discovery. Though many of these products are very common in our supermarkets, at one point, they were considered foreign and exotic. So let's go back a little bit in time to 15th century Portugal. Portugal had established itself as a country on the world stage. It had survived through a number of various occupations, and it was ready to make its presence known. And leading this idea to make it a stronger country was Prince Henry. He was the fourth son of King John I, and he was fascinated by how the world worked. He wanted to see Portugal become a bigger player on the stage, and the best way for them to do this would be through the spice trade. But Prince Henry was smart. He recognized the country's limitations. Portugal was a landlocked country. To the north at the time was Galicia, to the east was Castile and Aragon, and to the south was Morocco and unknown Africa. And to the west, well, there lied the unknown, uncharted waters of the Atlantic Ocean. But Portugal was also resource poor. They didn't have any of these various spices growing in their homelands. And so in order to become a part of the spice trade, Prince Henry thought the quickest idea would be to take control of the Strait of Gibraltar. Now, the Strait of Gibraltar in Europe was already controlled by present-day Spain, and so that wasn't really an option. Prince Henry saw the opportunity to then pursue the African side, specifically in the town of Ceuta. And so he rallied up his countrymen, and they attacked the city of Ceuta in a surprise attack at sunrise. And by nightfall, they had captured the city. And it was a surprise victory. People were genuinely impressed that a small country like Portugal had been able to take on a force like the Moors. But the victory was very short-lived and bittersweet, because Along the Strait of Gibraltar in Africa, there's more than just one port city. Ceuta was a great way to get into the Mediterranean, but when the Moors realized they had lost that land, they just moved a little bit farther down to the city of Tangier. Well, that left the Portuguese with a port that wasn't really of much value and was a drain on their military and other material resources. So they returned back to the homeland of Portugal. And it was there that Prince Henry realized that, okay, the best option to make the riches for Portugal would be to go out into the unknown, uncharted waters of the Atlantic. And that was very terrifying at a time when not much was known what laid out there. So to ensure his victories, he established a navigation school. And at his school in Sagres, he ended up collecting many of the greatest minds in maritime travel. With these minds, they trained the next generation of explorers because it was through their voyages that the gold, God, and glory would be achieved for Portugal. And having all of these great minds in one place resulted in the creation of a great series of new technology. The first of this was a brand new ship called the Caravel. This ship featured a new invention of triangle sails called lateen sails. And the lateen sail was important because square sails previously used on ships were great when the wind was in your direction. But imagine, if the wind isn't going the way you want, it's going to take a lot of manpower to keep moving in a particular way. With the lateen sail, the sailors could manipulate the wind's power to propel the ship in whatever direction they chose. Additional technologies that were added were the magnetic compass. It was brought to Sagres, developed and improved upon for more accuracy. Another fun invention that was created was the mariner's astrolabe. And this mariner's astrolabe was a circular device that sailors could hold up and find a point in the sky, usually a star or a sun, and compare it to where it was at the horizon. And using a series of graphs and various maps, they could more accurately pinpoint their location. And of course, if you're going to begin any new expedition, you're going to need maps. And Portugal was regarded as one of the greatest map-making centers in Europe. The reason for this was previously the city of Genoa in present-day Italy was sought as the greatest map-making center. But in the late 1300s, due to political strife, there was a mass exodus of people that ended up leaving and going and seeking refuge in Lisbon. And as a result, many of the great map makers went to Lisbon and it became known as a hotspot for cartographers. So with sailors being trained, technology being invented, now the big question is, what's for dinner on this incredibly long journey that has no end date in sight, and honestly, we don't really know where we're going? Well, oh my God, do I have an answer for you? Oh yes, I went there. Anyways, cod is essential to Portuguese identity. It's really a way of life, and it makes sense when you think about it. Portugal was a coastal country, and so it makes sense that they would eat this fish. But cod is not native to Portuguese waters. In fact, it's mostly located in Scandinavia. So why this particular fish? It was very interesting. It was low in fat and acid. So when it was caught, it could promptly be gutted, trimmed, and preserved with salt, which then created a new food group called bacalhau. And this bacalhau had a very low risk of rotting, which was why Portuguese sailors utilized it on their long voyages. On their return, the Portuguese then shared it with the people of the country, and they too loved it because of its reliability, and it just became ingrained in society over the centuries. So much so that the idea of Bacalhau 365 came about, and this is the idea that for every single day of the year, there is a new salted cod recipe. From all of the different regions in Brazil and various ingredients that were introduced over time, there truly are countless recipes. And when you come and travel with us on the Douro, you'll be able to try some of these for yourself. So with trained sailors, new technology, food to go, good to go, it is time to go exploring. And the first task to accomplish on this would be to map out the African coastline. During the time of Prince Henry, very little was known what lied beyond the Moorish African coast, and so they wanted to map out beyond the hump of Africa. Prince Henry himself would end up sponsoring 10 different journeys, and for the next 50 years, explorers would continue to push on to find out what lied in the unknown and to dispel various myths. The most prominent of this was to dispel the idea that the Indian Ocean was landlocked, because that was very commonly believed. And that would be bad news for Portugal, especially as they're trying to enter the spice trade through the Indian Ocean. So on the explorers went, and within Prince Henry's lifetime, over 1,500 miles of African coastline was mapped out. And in 1460, Prince Henry would die from natural causes. And this left for a very brief moment kind of a question in the air of where do we go from here? What is going to happen? Well, Prince Henry's legacy didn't really need to worry. He had already laid the foundation of what would become one of the greatest explorations of all time, as he truly propelled Portugal into the age of discovery. And that's why in history, we remember him as Prince Henry the Navigator. And he's seen here in Lisbon at the monument, the Discovery Monuments. So the first to go out of the gates after Prince Henry's death and to really take on a very difficult mission is Bartholomew Diaz. And his goal is to find out if there is a way to circumnavigate the bottom of Africa. And so he departed and skirted gently along the African Gold Coast because he was headed into a place that really nothing was known about. Legend told that the bottom of Africa was known as O Cabo dos Tempestades, or the Cape of Storms. That's not very inviting if you ask me. But Bartholomew Diaz pressed on and his mission is successful. So he rounded the Cape of Africa and he proved that the Indian Ocean was not landlocked. As a result, an ideology changes that no longer is this the Cape of Storms. It now becomes renamed O Cabo das Boas Esperanças, or the Cape of Good Hope. In addition to looking to see if there was a way to get past Africa, Bartholomew Diaz was also looking for a character named Prester John. And Prester John was a king that lived in Africa, and he was a Christian king. And legend told of his riches, but legend told of his riches because he was also a legend. He didn't actually exist. But during the time of Bartholomew Diaz and various other explorers, this was accepted as fact that Prester John lived in the African kingdom. And legend told that if a Christian king from Europe was able to make contact with Prester John, the two would be able to join forces and they would be able to expel the Moors from sub-Saharan Africa. Obviously, riches were also a great motivating factor. And all the explorers that I discussed today continued to look for Prester John. Now, as the Portuguese became more familiar and mapped out more of the African coastline, they became more familiar with the coastal villages and even became trading partners. For as much as I would like to say that these relations were positive, unfortunately, that wasn't always the case. At best, they were often hostile. And the reason for this was that the Portuguese were really utilizing the slave trade in Africa. In fact, they were going to warring regions along the Congo, buying prisoners of war and selling them into the Atlantic slave trade. So not necessarily a good side of history there. But utilizing those coastal villages, they were also filling up their ships with new supplies, whether that was food or fresh water to continue on their voyages. In addition to those goods, they were also trading for some new cultural nices. The first one was called the calabash gourd, native to Africa. And it was utilized because when it was dried out, it could be used to store dry goods. Additionally, other fun cultural nices found along the coast of Africa were gold, ivory, and even small amounts of pepper. And pepper was really a big driving force. So this was an incentive to keep going along the African coast. Now, the Portuguese, as they continued on their discoveries, especially when they got to Brazil, they would discover a series of new plants, and they would bring these plants to other lands that they were in contact with. And this was how the African's bird's eye chili pepper made its way to Mozambique. Now, what is the African bird's eye chili pepper? It is a tiny little red pepper that packs a punch. Originally from Brazil, the species was brought over, thrived in African soil, and eventually cross-pollinated with some other native species to create the pepper on your screen today. The Portuguese liked having these peppers around because it helped to preserve food for longer periods of time. 15th century, typically your food was either fresh or it wasn't, and in worst case scenarios, this chili pepper helped to mask the taste of rotten food. Doesn't that sound desirable? Not so much. But you probably recognize this pepper by a much more familiar name, and that would be the Piri chili pepper, or for its amazing sauce that it makes when combined with vinegar and garlic. You have Piri Piri sauce. This is so popular that it's like the equivalent of barbecue sauce in Portugal. And that led to the creation of a fantastic dish called Piri Piri chicken. Though debated whether or not this was actually created in Mozambique or in Portugal first, it's beloved by all. This is not something that you would make at home because it actually takes a couple of days for the spices to fully marinate into the meat. And so you'd go to your favorite local hotspot and eat it after it's been barbecued on a charcoal grill. Absolutely delicious. But it really reached mainstream popularity in the 1990s when an African restaurant named Nando's opened up in South Africa. And the popularity was widespread, so much so that locations are now found in Africa, Europe, Australia, and even here in the United States. Now, you can't talk about the Age of Discovery without bringing up one very important individual, and that, of course, is Mr. Christopher Columbus, because we all know that in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. But what you might not know is that Columbus actually went to the King of Portugal for sponsorship before he went to the King of Spain. Christopher Columbus had immigrated over from Genoa, Italy during the mass immigration, and he loved the water. He wanted to become an explorer. And so after hearing of all of the different successes, he approached the Portuguese king, Alfonso I, and said, I want to go to the Indies. Will you sponsor me? And the Portuguese king initially wanted to have this happen. He also wanted to make it to the Indies, and so he was debating it. But then Columbus said a radical idea. He didn't want to go under Africa. He wanted to shoot across the Atlantic Ocean and just see what happened to encounter a direct route that way. And that was when the Portuguese king said, no, I'm not interested. Thank you so much for the offer. Not to be deterred, Christopher Columbus then made his way over to the neighboring kingdom of then Castile and Aragon, present-day Spain, and they accepted his proposal. And so Christopher Columbus goes off on that remarkable journey, and he completes a transatlantic sail, the first explorer to do so. When he arrives over into what we now know as the Caribbean, he thought he had made it to the Indies. He thought he had made it all the way to the Indian Ocean. So he arrived in the Bahamas and he called it the Indies, and then he arrived in Cuba and he still called it the Indies. But regardless of his geographical confusion of the time, he had still made it to a world that had not previously been quote unquote discovered by other explorers. And he returns home after completing a successful voyage, but we'll get to him a bit later, because around the same time, a Portuguese explorer was getting ready to take to the high seas, and his name was Vasco da Gama, and Vasco da Gama was the chosen one of Portuguese explorers. It was his task to connect Portugal with India. So how was he going to do that? Well, he took a little bit of a different route than his other colleagues. He decided that rather than hugging the coastline of Africa, he was going to utilize something called os ventos do mar, or the trade winds. And utilizing the strong currents in the Atlantic, he was able to slingshot his ship underneath the Cape of Good Hope. And he makes it to the east coast of Africa. And as he's going along the coastline, he first arrives in Mozambique, and Mozambique would eventually become a Portuguese colony. Kind of foreshadowing the rest of history, relations immediately begin as hostile, primarily due to cultural differences. And so him and his crew continue up the coast to reach Mombasa. And in Mombasa, they are much more warmly accepted, and they're able to trade for a couple of goods, including a local navigator that will lead them across the Indian Ocean to India. And with this little bit of assistance, it finally happens with the arrival into the harbor of Calicut. He has done it. Portugal has accomplished what was considered to be the impossible. Vasco da Gama had connected Portugal to India purely by using water routes. This was major to world history and would forever change all future interactions. And even though Vasco da Gama's journey was not as quote-unquote successful as the Portuguese wanted, as he was not able to establish a permanent trading post, he had still made it. And he was able to trade for some pepper and other spices, and he returned home to Portugal to a victor's welcome. It was an amazing moment in history. Now, with the arrival into India meant the arrival into the spice market, which begs the question, why spices? Why was the spice market so lucrative, and why did everybody want to be a part of it? And it wasn't because they were just trying to flavor up their food. We live in a society today where we take for granted how easy it is to preserve our food through artificial cooling methods like refrigeration and freezing. But in the 15th century, this wasn't an option. Your food was either fresh or it wasn't. And more often than not, people would eat rotten food because it was the only thing that was available to them. Now, over time, spices were a plant that had evolutionized with what was going on in the world around them. And so these plants had become a natural deterrent to decomposers. Now, what decomposers? I'm talking about bacteria and fungi that love to metabolize quickly on aging food. And so by having these spices, they were able to deter them from arriving onto their food, and it had the added benefit of also adding to the flavor profile. Let's talk a couple of quick examples. So mint. Mint is the perfect example of how things evolutionized over time. So this plant began as just a normal foliage leaf, but it grew to have a distinct smell that to humans is wonderfully desirable, but to other plants and animals is disgusting. It deters them from even coming near it. And in fact, with a lot of bacteria, it's killed when exposed to the essential oil of mint. And this actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it, that our gum and our mints and our toothpaste are all mint flavored, because where the mint smell is, the bacteria isn't. Little food for thought right there. Of course, the most lucrative spice and the most coveted spice of the day was pepper. The pepper monopoly had been held by the Venetians, by the Ottomans, and by the Arabs in the East. And by arriving into India by boat, the Portuguese had just broken that monopoly for the future. Now, after pepper was picked, we have a couple examples of the plants on the screen. It would then be laid out on giant mats where it would dry out, and then it had a few different uses. Primarily, it could be used to store with food to keep it from becoming rotten. It could also be used to make things taste a little bit better, and an oil could be extracted that was coveted for medicinal purposes. So the next time that you go to use a little bit of pepper on your food, take this into consideration. At one point, this spice was worth more than its weight in gold. So ask yourself, how much did that little sprinkle of pepper cost you right there? Another very expensive plant that came about was cinnamon. Cinnamon was harvested and then processed to produce the lovely sticks that we know today. Cinnamon was a spice that not only tasted great on food, but again, acted as a natural deterrent. More and more it became popular though, because it was believed that cinnamon could help cure the common cold. Another very exotic spice that came out of entering into the spice trade was ginger. Ginger became a catch-all for the Portuguese. This could kind of cure just about everything, whether it was nausea, acting as an anti-inflammatory, or helping to relieve basic cold symptoms. Ginger could just about cure it all. Now, with this introduction into spices, a variety of different varietals were found inside of India, but having a control on that power would not be easy. You see, the Portuguese wanted to establish themselves as a dominant trading power in the region. That did not come with the warm welcome of the locals, so various battles ensued, and they were typically sweeping victories. The Portuguese had a very strong navy, and they knew what they wanted, so they went after it. And with every victory that was had, the Portuguese would build a new trading post in the town, and these trading posts were called feitorias. And feitoria, loosely translated, means factory. And at these factories, they were compounds where a Portuguese man named a factor would stay, and he would collect all of the spices and essentially hold them so that when more Portuguese ships arrived into the harbor, they could be loaded up, sent back to the motherland, and be quickly put on the European spice trade. And there were a variety of different types of feitorias. Sometimes it was just a fort, other times it could be an entire village or a city that was built up over time. Now, with these locals not necessarily loving the fact that the Portuguese are there, they decided to introduce some new foods to the area. So as the Portuguese were continuing to go out exploring, especially in Brazil, they brought back these new food items to India. And these included exotic new fruits and vegetables like the potato and the tomato. And they also introduced a new purposefully soured wine called vinegar. Probably the most impactful, though, was the introduction of the chili pepper. And with all of these new food groups being there, the locals and the sailors also kind of started to exchange some local customs. And one of the big ones was that the Portuguese sailors would eat something called vinho de alhos, which translates to wine and garlic. And it was a way that they could preserve their meat for longer periods of time. But the locals really liked the idea and they wanted to recreate it. But that was going to take a little bit of fusion, and over time, it would establish itself into vindaloo. This traditional Indian Portuguese dish, if you will, utilized the natural resources of India, whether from the spices to the palm vinegar that was collected. And it also infused New World ingredients like the tomatoes, the potatoes, and the chili pepper to create the vindaloo that we know today. And this still remains a very popular dish on many different menus. In addition, if you ever have the chance to go to India, Goan cuisine is a distinct type of Indian food that is a direct result of the Portuguese influence. They added a lot of the New World ingredients, and additionally, Goan wine was grandfathered by grapes from the Douro Valley. So everybody is out exploring. Christopher Columbus had returned home and proclaimed that he had done it, he had found the Indies, and he was going to be rich. And the Spanish were absolutely thrilled. They were joyous because this meant new riches, and it also meant that they should send out more voyages. But there was a little bit of a problem, and that's because next door neighbor Portugal was also out exploring. And next door neighbor Portugal was also having successes. And so realizing that there was the potential to have a disagreement on what belonged to who, the Spanish then went to the all-authoritarian power, Pope Alexander VI, and they requested that Pope Alexander VI release an official document that stated that not only did Spain have the right to claim these lands, but that they can continue to discover as they well pleased. And Pope Alexander VI was happy to oblige because the Spanish provided him not only with a lot of money, but they also helped him with military resources. And so in 1494, he releases a document, but it doesn't go as planned, because what happens when two kids start fighting? Spain saw the line and yelled, "But Dad, what are you doing? I wanted more land and you gave more land to Portugal." Okay, granted, I wasn't there. Pretty sure that's how it went down though. But Portugal was okay with the line. They had gotten what they wanted and Spain was very upset. So Spain went back to the Pope and they demanded that he change the line in their favor. And if the Pope did not do such a thing, the Spanish were going to pull out their power. They weren't going to help him in terms of military service. So the Pope moved the line. Well, what do you think Portugal did? "But Dad, why would you do that to us?" And then they proceeded to blackmail the Pope. Oh yes, a very fun time to be around. Eventually, after going back and forth a couple of times, the King of Spain and Portugal ended up meeting and compromising on a line together. And in 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas is signed. This is a line that went straight through the middle of the unknown Atlantic Ocean. And this was a way for them to establish power. To the west of that line would belong to Spain, and everything to the east of the line would belong to Portugal. So, pretty simple solution. But how did the rest of Europe feel about the world being split in half and nobody else was consulted? Oh, they absolutely hated it. Absolutely despised it. But there was not much that they could do about it at that time, and they luckily had the ability to hold a grudge. And it is amazing how long a country can hold a grudge for, and they would later come back to haunt Portugal in the later centuries. So with that, with new lines being drawn, Pedro Alvarez Cabral makes his debut in 1500, and he goes out on a dual mission. The first goal is to explore the new lands that were awarded to Portugal during the Treaty of Tordesillas. The second is to make his way to India to build upon the success of Vasco de Gama and to establish a few new victorias or trading posts in along the Indian coastline. So quick side note, if you're wondering how the Treaty of Tordesillas still affects us today, just take a look at that line. I know a lot of people have asked me, well, why does most of South America speak Spanish, but Brazil speaks Portuguese? that line right there. Because of the way that the map was cut, the tip of Brazil was for Portuguese exploration, and explore they did. They came, they claimed these lands, and they started creating residencies inside of them. Over time, as people continued to grow outwards, it became easier for those Brazilian colonists to expand outward compared to those that were living in the Spanish part that had to deal with the Andes Mountains. So that's why Brazil speaks Portuguese. Okay, back on track. So with Pedro Alvarez Cabral, he arrives into Porto Seguro for the first time. And here he meets with some of the locals, and they take him around for 10 days to see what the land had to offer. Unfortunately, Pedro Alvarez Cabral did not find gold just lying on the ground, and so he deemed that this colony, though worthy in land, didn't have much lucrative value going for it in comparison to what was happening in the Indian Ocean. So after leaving behind a padrão, or a rock marker that claimed this land for Portugal, he went on his merry way to India. However, before he left, he took note of a very special tree growing inside of the forest. And this tree had a bark that when you took the bark off, processed it, ground it up, and then boiled it with fabric, it would turn the fabric red. So this became, of course, a popular status symbol later for various royalties. But this tree is named the Pão Brasil, or the Brazilwood Tree, and it's from this tree that the country gets its name. So Brazil was a bit of a sleeper of a colony for the Portuguese. Even in the 1500s, they didn't really see much going on with it. They had a lot better gig going on in the Indian Ocean. And so they kind of let it sit for a while up until the 1530s. And that's when the French came around and they thought that that looked like a great piece of land. And they started to infringe upon it. And then the Portuguese got all defensive that that was their land and the French needed to leave. So in the 1530s is when the colonization of Brazil slowly but surely begins. And as the colonists came in, they started to discover a new variety of produce available to them that had never been seen before, like guava, pineapple, acai berries, papaya, guarana berries, passion fruit, and a very interesting fruit that I'd like to draw your attention to now. This red and yellow fruit on the upper right-hand corner of your screen is called the caju. And caju translates to cashew apple. And the top part of this fruit is very dense and juicy, but it's a very fine skin fruit, so it's not really available for commercial exportation. But bring your attention to that cute little curly Q at the end, because that, ladies and gentlemen, is where little baby cashews come from. Oh yes, that is where the cashews come from. So in addition to having a brand new world of produce at their disposal, cashews now enter into the Portuguese trading market. Additionally, indigenous plants like the black bean, corn, peppers, squash, tomatoes, peanuts, and mandioc root become available not only to be cultivated in Brazil, but also to be exported and cultivated worldwide. Now, Brazil, as I said, was a bit of a sleeper colony. And so as the Portuguese were going out and exploring more, they were making more and more trades. And this resulted in a lot of exotic fruits becoming available to be brought back to Portugal. And it created a new type of empire in terms of rice, sugarcane, and coffee. As for rice, it came in the 1530s and it was brought over by the Portuguese colonists. It was a food source that could feed the masses, and any additional supply could always be sent back home to Portugal. It was farmed in flooded fields and really had a high yield. In fact, on this map, you can see where it's now grown in Brazil today, but rice added to the cultural identity of Brazil because having lived there, I can tell you no day is complete until you have had at least one serving of rice and beans. In the 1550s, the next big thing came around, and that was sugar. My goodness, this would change Portugal's perception of Brazil for the rest of history because the sugarcane was brought over from the Spice Islands, and when it was planted in Brazilian soil, it absolutely flourished. It just took off, and so thousands of acres were planted. And after it was harvested, it was the sugarcane stalk that would then be cut down. That stalk was then juiced, believe it or not. And from that juice, the sugar was granulated for market sale. For over 300 years, this served as the dominant cash crop of Brazil and really brought a lot of riches, not only to the colony, but also to Portugal as well. And it would only be rivaled by a new substance introduced in 1527, our favorite beverage, coffee. Oh my goodness, coffee would change the face of Brazil forever, because when it was brought over by French explorers in the 1700s, again, like sugar planted in the soil, it absolutely thrived. And so plantations were planted, they were cultivated, they were harvested, and then eventually would get to the roasting process. And after being roasted, those beans would then be sent to the port of Santos, which is where I lived, and they would be sent out for exportation. This crop was a big deal. In fact, at one point, Brazil was producing 80% of the world's coffee, and it still remains one of their top exports today. Pedro Alvarez Cabral would eventually be proven wrong in terms of the lack of riches in Brazil, because gold was later found, as well as a variety of gemstones, most notably diamonds. But for as much as this brought riches, it must be noted that it was through the use of slave labor that all of this mining was possible. It was also the slave population that would leave a lasting impact on Brazil, even influencing one of the country's most favorite dishes, feijoada. Despite the popular myth that the slaves invented this, they just influenced it, because the original feijoada actually came from Portugal. Portuguese feijoada was composed of red kidney beans, various cuts of pork meat, and turnip greens and carrots, and it was stewed for an extended period of time. It was a very homey dish, very filling, and it could feed the masses. And so when it was brought over to Brazil, it was modified to make it more accessible to the people. Kidney beans were replaced with the native black bean, and various cuts of pork were used. If you were higher up in society, your feijoada would include pork cuts like the ham steak or the ribs, so the higher qualities of meat. But if you were lower class, and specifically if you were a slave, it was the not so good sides of meat. That included pork feet, pork snout, pork ears, and pork tails. And yes, that is considered to be a traditional feijoada. Over time, the dish continued to evolve when more spices from the Indies were brought over, as well as the introduction of sweet citrus from Asia. So all of these little components came together to create the national dish of Brazil. So Pedro Alvarez Cabral had his success in creating feijoadas in India, and more explorers were going out to see what was in the world around them, which is going to lead us on a small tangent real quick on a man named Mr. Amerigo Vespucci. And Amerigo Vespucci was a great explorer. He was very good friends with many of the big names of the day, including Christopher Columbus. But as Christopher Columbus continued to brag to many different people that he had found the Indies, Amerigo Vespucci publicly doubted that claim. He thought that that couldn't quite be possible. In fact, there must be another landmass blocking our way to get to the Indian Ocean. Never mind the Pacific Ocean, but the Atlantic at least stood in the way. And so, having no loyalty truly to either crown, he sailed for both of them. And during his missions, with Spain, he'd go to the Caribbean, and with Portugal, he'd go to present-day Rio de Janeiro. But he confirmed to himself that this was not the Indies. This was a brand new world that had not previously been discovered or recorded. And so we remember Christopher Columbus in our history books for that incredible transatlantic voyage. Amerigo Vespucci was an incredible publicist in his day. He wrote articles, he gave lectures, all about how this was not the Indies, it was a new world. So much so, in fact, that in 1507, a German cartographer named Martin Waldseemüller was creating a brand new world map. And take a moment and just examine some of the intricacies of this. You can see in the middle, Europe is very clearly defined because it had been discovered, it had been charted, it had been mapped. There was really nothing new to find. But Africa had started to take a better shape. From the knowledge of the Portuguese explorers, they were able to map it out more accurately. Off to the right, Asia, still a little bit unknown, and so it's a little bit murkier and a little bit more disformed. But now look over to the left, and you'll see that there's a strip of land that had been added. And Martin Waldseemüller added this particular landmass. And if you're going to add a new continent to the map, you need to name said continent. Well, fun fact, continents are female. And so Martin Watts Miller took Amerigo Vespucci's name, feminized it ever so slightly, and in 1507, America is put on the map for the very first time. This map is actually now in Washington, D.C. In a joint venture with National Geographic, the Library of Congress purchased the map, and it now remains on public display. So next time you're at our nation's capital, go give it a look. So the navigation continued. There were new maps coming out, new technologies being created, new supplies being traded, and the Portuguese had created a very strong hold on the Indian spice trade. But there was a new desire to keep pushing further. Rather than just having the Indian spice market, they wanted to control the Indian Ocean spice market, and that meant pushing farther east to a new area called the Spice Islands, or what we now know as present-day Indonesia. And the explorer tasked with this job was Alfonso de Albuquerque. He had already proven himself as a ruthless yet powerful leader as he oversaw many different Victorias in India. And so he is selected, and he and his crew, they sail over to the Spice Islands. And upon arrival, they begin making trades. But this is a very strategic move on Alfonso de Albuquerque's part. He was looking to see what was available, what were the spice riches of the different islands, but also where was the best place to attack. And ultimately, he decided on the capital of Malacca. And it is a sweeping victory simply because the Portuguese had much better technology. And so with the conquering of Malacca, a Victoria is established in the Spice Islands. And now the Portuguese have control over two new substances, actually three. They have the clove, and also growing from the same plant, the mace and nutmeg plant. So let's talk a little bit about cloves. It grows on trees, and it's from the flowers that the clove is pulled off and then later dried. And after it was dried, it could be used for a variety of different things. Number one, it acted as a natural anesthetic, especially for dental work. So can you imagine going to the dentist and just having your mouth packed full of cloves? Yeah, that was kind of the equivalent. Additionally, the oil from clove could be extracted, and it worked great as a perfume, but also as a digestive aid. Another plant that was important was the mace and nutmeg tree. And coming from this bulbous flower, when it opened up, inside was a pit, and that was where you found the mace and nutmeg. And on the outer layer, that red covering, that is mace. Once it was taken off the inner hard seed that was nutmeg, it could be dried up and ground into a fine powder, and it was used as a painkiller. Additionally, has the added benefit of having a very subtle nutty taste to it. But probably the most magical of all of these spices was nutmeg. At the time, it was believed in massive quantities, nutmeg had the ability to cure the bubonic plague. So you can imagine the price that it went for as it swept across Europe. So how was Portugal so powerful? Why were they able to take over all of these different areas when they weren't even taking over the country? And that's because the Portuguese held a Victoria Empire, or a trading post empire. From the early days of Prince Henry, it was recognized that Portugal was a very small country. They didn't have the population to support both a strong army and a strong navy. They kind of had to choose one or the other. And so the strong navy was selected, and as they had the best sailors and the best technologies, it made it easier to go and explore new lands and to assert their dominance with their advanced weaponry. Additionally, at all of these different trading posts, they were establishing their presence because other ships were still welcome to trade in the Indian Ocean. There was just a slight catch, and that was that you had to pay a fee. And this was called a cartaz. Whether you wanted to define it as a tax or a fine, it was a rite of passage to pay to the Portuguese in order to continue to sail. Now, whether you stopped at a port or you were stopped by a Portuguese patrolling ship, didn't matter. You had the option. You could pay the very high, but not necessarily unreasonable cartaz fee, or your ship would be ransacked and your crew would be harmed. So, it really didn't leave much wiggle room in what your decision was going to be. And it was from the cartaz fees that were collected that the Vitorias were supported and that they were able to send this money back to Portugal. So that is how they were able to control all of these different areas. And having control now completely over the spice market on the Indian Ocean, Portugal was making a lot of money, and people, well, they want to spend that money, especially on new goods. So in 1513, a man named Jorge Alvarez left with an expedition from the Spice Islands, leaving from Malacca, to see what new trading partners were out there. And they eventually made their way to the Guangzhou province of China. It was here that he was exposed to a multitude of new Chinese goods, including fine lacquer furniture, delicate Chinese porcelain, and very intricate, beautiful Chinese silks. Of course, these go for a very pretty penny, and luckily the country is so rich, Portugal is able to afford them when they're brought back, and it becomes all the rage. In addition to finding new cultural nices, Jorge Alvarez also discovered a new source of nutmeg and pepper for the Portuguese, as well as for the first time finding cilantro and coriander returned back to Portugal as a noble spice. Now, citrus was in Europe, but at the time it was a very bitter, sour citrus. In fact, it was only really good for making marmalades, and it required a lot of sugar that came from the Portuguese colony. So sweet oranges, when they introduced, become a new status symbol. In fact, in history books, it's been recorded that King Louis XIV was recorded walking around his kingdom carrying sweet oranges simply to show his wealth. Another fun new citrus was the lime. Though sour, it could be brought over and it had its own citric acid properties. And of course, a new sweet fruit, the peach. But probably one of the biggest trades that will happen is for this fine little substance called tea. It was a dried leaf that could travel for extended distances without going bad. On top of that, it was steeped in water, which when you think about the sanitation practices back in the day, I'm sure that really helped with the quality of the water that they were drinking. But tea returns back to the Portuguese court, and it's immediately a favorite of the royals. They want to incorporate this into a status symbol, and they're very successful in doing it. It's just a part of their lifestyle. But in 1662, a royal marriage took place that would change Britain forever. So royal marriages were always used to strengthen political alliances. And so the marriage of Princess Catherine of Braganza of Portugal to the future King of England, Charles II, made pretty good sense. And it's worth noting that Portugal and Britain are actually extremely good allies. They have one of the longest alliances in history. So Catherine of Braganza, when she comes over, in addition to her extensive dowry that included the port city of Bombay, oh yes, that is how the British got to the Indian spice trade, her dowry included the city of Bombay. She also brought with her the custom of taking a break in the afternoon, drinking from fine porcelain cups, enjoying a great conversation, and conversing with her friends. And seeing this new idea, the upper class English want to be a part of the new culture the trendy new princess is creating. And so because of Catherine of Braganza of Portugal, tea time becomes all the rage in England. Please note that Catherine of Braganza was not the first person to bring tea to England. In fact, there were a lot of different explorers that were exchanging quite a good number of goods. Historians actually don't know which particular explorer was the first to bring tea to England, but Catherine of Braganza certainly did popularize the idea of tea time. Now, relations continued on with China, and in 1557, in order to secure a more established alliance with the Portuguese, the Chinese approached them and said, we will give you the Macau trading port and you can set it up as a Victoria, but we want to guarantee that you will continue to bring us riches from the New World. They were intrigued with goods like silver, fur, and various lumbers that were coming over. And the Portuguese, recognizing how strong this could be, accepted, and Macau was given to the Portuguese on permanent lease. Now, I would be remiss in this presentation of food to not even mention the Macau Portuguese egg tart, because it is a great example of how many different cultural fusions happened over the last couple of centuries. And in Macau, there was a British man that was living there in the 1980s. So 1980s, Englishman living in Macau, and he wanted to open up a bakery, and to pay homage to the Portuguese traditions in the area, he decided to put a Portuguese egg tart on the menu. This was supposed to resemble a pastel de nata or a pastel de Belém that was famous from Lisbon. But the problem with this was that when he made it, he put English custard in it. So please note that if you go to Macau and enjoy one of these delicious egg tarts, that it is not a pastel de nata or a pastel de balim. However, it is a great example of how tasty cultural fusions can be. Moving on to our next navigator, and in 1519, Ferdinand Magellan comes onto the scene. He was a Portuguese sailor that pulled to Columbus, and after not getting sponsorship from Portugal, he ended up going to the Spanish kingdom next door, and they agreed. And Magellan's idea was that he wanted to circumnavigate the world. He wanted to see if he could get around the world purely by the waterways. And this was a bit of a controversial idea. At the time, it was not uncommon to believe that the world was flat, so he was running a little bit of a risk here. So he set off in 1519, and he is able to cross the Atlantic Ocean with no issues, makes his way through the Strait of Magellan in South America, goes completely through the Pacific Ocean, and even makes it into the Indian Ocean. And his ship does return, so technically his voyage is a success. But in 1521, upon arrival into the Indian Ocean, he arrived in the Philippines and was promptly killed by the locals. And so he did not return to Spain, but his crew did. Still a momentous new establishment in society, because not only had they proven that you could circumnavigate the world by water, they'd proven the world was also round, that you weren't just going to fall off. So major accomplishments being done here, but small, slight problem. Do you remember back in the late 1400s that there was a big argument over what was going to happen with the world being divided in two? Yeah, how do you think that's going to fare when we prove that the world is round? So Portugal comes back, and now it's Portugal's turn to go, but Mom, oh my goodness, the Portuguese were so nervous because they did not want to lose everything that they had built up in the Indian Ocean. They had fought to create new feitorias. They had fought to establish this as their trading dominance, and they did not want the Spanish having any little part of it. And so a lot of strife is held up until an agreement is reached in 1529 called the Treaty of Zaragoza, and another line is drawn, this time in the Pacific Ocean, to establish new boundaries for Spain. So that leaves the middle part of your map was under Portuguese control, and on either side, on the edges of the map, that belonged to Spanish control. So with new lines being now clearly established, in 1543, a merchant named Antonio da Mota, he wanted to continue his tradings with China. He was making very good money off of it, and so he decided to travel with a group back to Macau. But he probably chose the worst possible time to do this, because it was monsoon season, and his ship was completely blown off course. So when they finally made landfall, Da Mota noticed that this land definitely was not China. This was no place that they had ever been before. And he was right. He had landed on the present-day Isle of Tanegashima, which is part of Japan. And so he had made contact with Japan. Upon meeting the locals, relations were not nearly as hostile as they had been in other countries, because the Japanese were absolutely fascinated with the Portuguese. They had a different face. They had interestingly shaped noses. They had facial hair, and they carried around with them new technologies, from something as simple as a button on their shirt to the very impressive muskets that they used for protection. And so, wanting to make a good impression, the warlord of Tanegashima invited the Portuguese to follow him to the port city of Nagasaki. And upon their arrival, the Portuguese are greeted very warmly. It's a very positive reception. So much so that Japan, who was a series of warring smaller states, was looking for better technology to fight in their battles. At the time, the samurai-style sword was still the most popular method on the battlefield, and they knew about guns from their Chinese counterparts across the way, who were their most definite enemies, but they wanted to have something better, and the Portuguese definitely had that. So the warlord of Tanegashima made them an offer. If you return back to this area with master musket makers, I will give you the port city of Nagasaki. Simple as that. And of course, the Portuguese say, absolutely. So this voyage goes on. They return back with the master musket makers. Try saying that 5 times fast. And guns become a development in Japan. So not only are they being brought over in masses from Portugal and being traded, but additionally, they're now being developed in Japan itself. They also shared their new technology. Of course, I like to bring up the button, such a novel concept, but it was such a cool technological invention at the time. The Portuguese also capitalized off of the embargo between China and Japan. They were far enough away from each other that the Portuguese could trade with both, and they were able to trade each other's goods. So porcelain and silks were continuously exchanged back and forth. So with goods being traded, customs were traded as well. And this was where Portuguese history as a Catholic nation came into play. Many of the explorers were Catholic, and it was held in their religion that they would not eat meat on Fridays and also during the Lent season. So they had a favorite snack. And this snack was of green beans that were dipped in batter and fried. It was called peixinhos da horta, or the little fish from the garden. Such a fun little name. But this dish was produced by the Japanese, and they loved it, so much so that they took this idea and they continued to build upon it, utilizing new ingredients. And it's from Portuguese origin that tempura became the cultural sensation in Japan today. Another major exchange happened here, and that was linguistically speaking. To say thank you in Portuguese, you use the term obrigado. And obrigado was something that the sailors would say to their Japanese counterparts whenever a deal was completed, and probably not trying to be rude. The Japanese wanted to reply back, but they didn't have an equivalent. And so historic linguists do believe that, not trying to be rude, they'd repeat back what they heard. So the Portuguese would say obrigado, and the Japanese would reply back, arigato. And that is how those two words came to be so important in the culture. Gotta love little exchanges. So in addition to all of these wonderful goods and foods being traded, there were also a lot of ideas, primarily religion. The Portuguese were always on the hunt for Prester John, but additionally, in any new land that they settled, they were looking to build upon their historic legacy. They wanted to convert the locals and bring them into their religion. With new produce being brought from place to place and having to grow it on non-native soil, the need for new farming technology came about, and it became easier and easier as more expeditions were going out to share what process worked best. Of course, technologies were being developed, from the Caravel to the gun to even the button being shared. These great technological advancements helped bring society to a new level. And of course, fabrics. Whether it was the dye from Brazil, furs from the New World, or silks from the Orient, goods were being exchanged in a way that had never previously been done. Now, it's hard to talk about all of the goods of the Portuguese Empire when you don't also talk about the negative side. And that came with the cost of the slavery market systems that were perpetuated by the Portuguese during the Age of Discovery. And it wasn't just in Africa. Slave markets also existed in Asia and also in the labor enforcement of the natives. Additionally, colonization resulted in the exploitation of a lot of natural resources that would decimate the way of life for many of the native peoples. Also, as the Portuguese arrived, that meant new diseases were coming into contact with people that had never seen them before. So something as simple as an influenza could wipe out an entire group of indigenous peoples. Now, with all empires, there is a rise and a fall, and the Iberian Union, or the Portuguese Empire, was no different. And the beginning of the end really began for the Portuguese in 1580. The Spanish king, or the Portuguese king, Sebastian, he died in battle without an heir, and that left a major succession crisis. Who was going to take the throne? There were many attempts made to try and put a Portuguese citizen on the throne, but that didn't work out, and ultimately it was the King of Spain, Philip II, that would claim the throne and unify the Iberian Union and Portugal together. And this didn't work out so good, because if you recall, all of the different countries that were holding grudges, that's where they're going to come into play, because Portugal, even though they had the cartay system, they really didn't have any enemies. It was accepted that that was a fee that people just had to pay. Spain, on the other hand, definitely had enemies in France, in the Netherlands, and in Europe. And so when war broke out against Spain, the Spanish didn't want to give up their citizens to go fight in the war because they were benefiting off of the Age of Discovery. So instead, they conscripted the Portuguese men to go fight their battles. This makes an issue because then who is going to support the Portuguese Navy? Who is going to hold up that Victoria Empire that is completely reliant on that strong Navy base? And so, recognizing that there was weakness in the air, the Dutch swept in. And in 1602, the Dutch East India Trading Company is created. And this is the first of its kind. It wasn't owned by royals, it was owned by businessmen. And it was traded on this new idea called the stock market. But the sole purpose of the Dutch East India Trading Company was to take over all of the Portuguese feitorías and forts that were located in the Indian Ocean. And because there was such a weak navy at the time, it was very successful. How successful? They were able to take over major hubs in Japan, in the Spice Islands, and in India as well. So just completely wiped out all of the hard work that had been achieved by the Portuguese in that last century. It's so successful, in fact, that in 1621, the Dutch create a new company called the Dutch West India Trading Company. And this sole purpose is to take over the ports that are located in Brazil and along the African coastline. And guess what? They are equally as successful. The Portuguese have no means of trying to protect their forts, and so the Dutch move in. Luckily, though, the Brazilians at the time, and by Brazilians, I mean the Portuguese colonists, the native peoples, and the slaves that were living over there, they did not like the Dutch rule. They much preferred the Portuguese rule. And in 1640, they ended up putting up a battle against the Dutch, and they pushed them out of Brazil. It was incredible. A colony had defeated a major power. And based off of this success, the Brazilians built up the courage that 5 years later, they went across the Atlantic Ocean and ended up fighting for the freedom of Angola as well. And they expelled the Dutch from Angola, leaving it again to the Portuguese powers. Now, by the time the Iberian Union ended in around 1640, not much could be done to salvage what was lost. In the Spice Islands, the only stronghold that they held was in East Timor. China, they still had Japan or Macau. Along the Indian coast, they only had Diu and Goa, and Bombay would eventually go along with Catherine of Braganza's dowries. And their colonies that remained were Angola, Mozambique, and Brazil. And when you think about in the 200 years of what an empire the Portuguese established and how many goods and technologies were exchanged in such a short period of time, it's clear to see that the seeds of globalization were already in the works. And even though it was a little bit of a slow dial-up speed, if you will, they were in the process of creating the world's first World Wide Web. Now, the Portuguese Empire would last around 600 years, beginning with the adventures of Prince Henry in 1415. It would come to an end in 1999 when Macau was returned to China, and it still remains an autonomous zone to this day. So when we think back to the little country that just wanted to be bigger than itself, when we think about the explorers that were daring enough to go into the unknown, about the exotic fruits and vegetables that were introduced and traded freely in new lands, it's really remarkable the impact that the Portuguese had in shaping our world today. A lot of people say that all roads lead to Rome, but I think when you really start to think about the Portuguese influence, I think that you can say that because of the Age of Discovery, everything leads back to sugars, spices, and cultural nices. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for spending your evening with me today. This has been an absolute pleasure to present, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Halsey. That was great. So we did get a couple of great questions in here, if you're ready for it.
Absolutely.
All right, and we don't have a lot of time, so we'll just hit a couple.
Okay.
What types of food items from the indigenous people of the Americas were brought back to Portugal and ultimately incorporated into the cuisine?
A very good question. So going back to a lot of those exotic fruits, from the Pontifical region of Brazil came guava and pineapple, and a lot of the berries that were utilized for energy purposes like acai and guarana, those were incorporated. Additionally, from the Mesoamerica area, so up in Mexico, foods like the tomatoes, the potatoes, the squash and the pepper were brought over. They were already in Brazil by the time of the Portuguese arrived, but it just added a little bit of extra flair. And when you go over to Brazil, you'll be able to taste it in the food, especially if there's something a little bit spicy in there. That's definitely the influence of the Brazilians.
Great. And then speaking of foods that you may have already tried, can you tell us what your favorite Portuguese food is?
Oh, okay. I have the biggest sweet tooth on the face of the planet. And so a dish that I tell everybody that they need to not try one, but one of each type is any Portuguese pastry, specifically the pastel de nata or the pastel de Belém, which you can find all over Lisbon. But every market has their own style of doing it. And I will say that I am that person that I go, oh, there's a new post. We need to go inside and buy another one. And people will look at me, they're like, we had one 30 seconds ago. Absolutely, go have another one. They're delicious.
That leads us to our next question, actually. Do you have a favorite pastry spot anywhere specifically?
Oh, I will tell you this. I've yet to find a pastry that I don't like. Any of the locations that I've tried have been absolutely incredible. So there hasn't been one that just absolutely sticks out, but the pastel de Belém is pretty special, and that is made directly in Lisbon.
And we actually have somebody writing in here saying, will you be one of our local guides on the Tauck tour of Portugal? Which is a good question.
That is a good question. So I'm part of the Tauck team. So I will be working as one of the tour directors on the Douro River boats, but we will leave the local work to the locals because the Portuguese, they're able to tell such an incredible story. And believe me when I say that, myself and all of my colleagues, we are so excited to share the Douro River with you when the time comes.
Absolutely. Oh, here's a good one, Halsey. This is just coming in. Halsey, unusual name. Any relation to World War II ADM Halsey?
Yes, actually. He is my extended cousin. We're laughing about this because that's actually how I introduced myself to Kelly initially. Hi, I'm Halsey, like the Admiral. It is an extended relation, but it has been passed down generation to generation. My father is Sanford Halsey Kinne the third, but I am the first female to have it, and it was the first time in my family it was used as a first name.
Amazing. Okay, so one last question, and I can help if you'd like. There was a question in here asking if there's a Tauck tour that combines Portugal and Spain.
Yes, there is.
Oh, okay.
Tour, and forgive me, that is not a tour that I run, so the name escapes me, but I do know that an Iberian tour does exist, and I believe that there's a land tour as well as a small ship.
Yes, you're right. And the land tour that we do is Spain and Portugal. It begins in Porto and it ends in Madrid. We spend 5 days in Portugal, 8 days in Spain. Some of the major cities that we cover would be Porto, Madrid, Lisbon, Seville, Cordoba, and others. So yes, definitely.
I've heard nothing but incredible things about it, so definitely something to check out.
Yep. All right, so I think we should probably close out for the night, and I want to just let everybody know this will be available in a recording, and it'll be available on our blog at Tauck. So you go to www.tauck.com/blog, and that's the Taucker, and that's where you can find this recording as well as all of our other Inside Tauck events. If you have any questions that we didn't get to, and we're sorry that we didn't, just go ahead to insideTauck at tauck.com. And we also have a really amazing group of people that are here to answer any questions that you have about specific tours, about future traveling. And that's our reservation sales counselors that are at 1-800-788-7885. And we'd love to hear from you. Thank you, everybody, and have a great evening. Thank you, Halsey.